Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I don't think I'm needed. I'm assuming she can just come back up here and finish, if that's okay with everybody here. I don't have much to add in regards to an intro here. The title is Gun Possession in Chicago, What the Headlines Don't Tell You. This is a conversation about why people carry, and we hope to get beyond the headlines, essentially. We want to go beyond the narratives that you may have heard, and talk to the folks who interact with the people most involved in this conversation the most often. Our panelists cover all aspects of this conversation: research, legality, activism and community, and faith as well. And so I think those are all the people who need to be a part of this conversation, and I'm hoping we can have a good one. Without further ado, let's get going. For the folks who are on Zoom, which seemingly is the large majority of the crowd, please use the Q&A feature. Submit your questions there, and toward the end, we will get 2 or 3 of those in as well. Panelists here are Father David Kelly, Robert Vargas, Emmanuel, Andress, and Kofi Ademola. And let's go ahead and get started. I think the first thing that comes to mind in regards to this conversation is the main reasons driving people to carry guns illegally around the city. So often, what you hear and what you see is that it has something to do with committing violence. It has something to do with perpetuating violence. And a lot of times these folks are viewed as the blemish on the city that's leading to these numbers that you hear the police superintendent rattle off every Monday morning on the news. But I would challenge everyone here to open their minds on that front. And to get going, I want to just start with Kofi here. Can you talk about, because you interact with the people involved in this conversation so often, and I think as an activist, your first skill is always people. Tell me what a lot of onlookers are missing in regards to this conversation around why people carry.
Firstly, good afternoon, and thank you for having me in this space. I don't regard myself as an activist. I don't use that label. I'm someone, when I was 15, I witnessed a good friend of mine get killed in front of me. And between the ages of 15 and 17, I carried a gun. Ironically, I didn't get caught with my own guns. I got caught with a homie's gun. And at 17, I became a felon, unlawful use of a weapon. And I was impacted by the 94 crime bill, essentially, that was pretty much crafted by Bill Clinton, our now President Joe Biden, and others. Because in the mid-90s, late 90s, et cetera, local law enforcement, local elected officials also kind of adopted a lot of the policies that kind of came out of the crime bill. So being tried as an adult, versus a juvenile, definitely had an impact on my life. And now kind of the work I do, I work with the young people of Good Kids Mad City. They are a violence prevention, anti-violence group that have essentially been trying to build peace in the city for the past 3 years, and effectively trying to also change policy in the city of Chicago on the city level. But the young people that are kind of street involved, that kind of go through a lot of the things that I personally experienced. The main reason I carried a gun was for safety. I wasn't looking to harm anybody. I was looking to protect myself. Going about getting your FOIA card and going through the legal process, that's just not really accessible to a lot of people. And clearly, if you're not 21, you can't even start that process. Safety, I would say, is the number one concern for young people who carry guns, right? And are probably primarily the ones that are getting caught with guns. A lot of people that are active shooters that really cause a lot of harm that we're seeing translate into the media. They really don't carry guns in themselves. They use the tool for their particular thing, and then they get rid of that gun 9 times out of 10. So a lot of, people that get caught up in the system, et cetera, usually are, again, thinking about safety, are dealing with trauma, are dealing with loss, are dealing with pain. And, you know, to me, that's kind of the conversation that we don't have about. We don't talk about, one, the root causes of violence, right? What brings young people to the point where, they don't know how to utilize restorative justice practices. They don't know how to utilize conflict resolution. We don't talk about the roles that toxic masculinity plays into it. The ways that violence and racism that the Black community, brown communities have experienced, how that's translated to how we respond to trauma and how we respond to conflict. There's only the criminal legal response around accountability, and mass incarceration in itself is a form of violence. And if punitive measures are the only ways that we kind of deal with this head on, we see the results, right? We see the fact that more money gets invested into policing, more money gets invested into prisons, but we don't see a reduction in the violence that's happening. We don't see any real accountability for perpetrators. More importantly, we don't see any resources being poured into survivors and families of victims, right? We should be centering the healing of people that are impacted by violence, but instead we put resources into locking people away in cages, never really dealing with the harm that happened. So that's just kind of my brief analysis.
Yeah. I want to come back to the kind of punitive measures that we as a society make on those individuals. But Emmanuel, I want to bring you in really quickly to discuss some of the stories that you've heard. Obviously, you work directly with these folks that may be dealing with some sort of legal action surrounding gun possession or carrying. What do they tell you? What are the stories that you hear? Because so often, it seems these things start off as something small, something on social media. Somebody took somebody's girlfriend or something of that nature, and it escalates. And I'm wondering, what are the stories that you hear in regards to why people carry, and also how seemingly small incidents can become tragic?
Thank you for the question. And again, first and foremost, thank you all for having me. Special thanks to those out there on virtual land. There's a 10% chance my mother might be out there. Mom, I am at Northwestern, see? But going back to the importance of that question of what I hear. So I'm a practicing defense attorney, and in the work that I've done, I actually want to answer the social media piece first and link it back to what Mr. Kofi mentioned in terms of what we've decided to invest in. We've made a conscious decision to be able to invest in incarceration. Our vision of accountability has been punishment, and that has been linked, and I don't want to dismiss the historical context, as Professor Robin started off, the historical context of that over time. So when we put it all in perspective, issues of race, guns, and healing has been fundamental to the American narrative. So with all that said, though, I'm just a lawyer with a tie on talking, and I'm going to stop right there because I think in many ways, instead of me taking someone's story and summarizing it and giving it to you, right, and going through all the biases that I had with them, I actually have a story that I wanted to share a bit. Hopefully the people in virtual land can see. So, Mom, hopefully you can see this, but to put it into proper context, this story is actually a confession. It's a written statement, and I'm surrounded by brilliant lawyers and law students all around me. They'll tell you the confession is the holy grail in a case, short of a video, but that's it. You get that confession, you get it. But I want to just read this piece. Now, there's some of it that you don't see, like the part that says voluntary statement. Now, this is a real story. The name is a pseudonym, but my name is Malcolm. I am making this statement voluntary. Today, many of my family members were at the house helping us move out. We are moving out because on Sunday, some guys shot at me in front of my house. Before then, someone tried to kick in the door while my grandmother was in the house. Before that, someone tried to rob my brother and me. Our house has also been broken into by someone. We've made police reports for these things, but after everything that has happened, it just seems like the police can't protect me and my family. So I decided to move out. What I want you all to take from this, and it's always hard because this is someone who doesn't get noticed until they are in custody on a gun possession charge. So all the complaints before, it is part of this narrative of consistent communal abandonment by society and our inability to view people as they are. In this case, this young person who's navigating all the trauma that Kofi talked about in real terms. And they're telling us, making it very, very clear, this is what's happening to me. I want to just show you see if I could get this to work. All right, this is the second part of it. Thank you for the tech people, by the way. My uncle, I believe it's there. My uncle gave me a 9mm Beretta to help protect my family. Then he goes on, I don't have a gun card. And then he ends, I am not a criminal, nor did I have bad intentions. I only had the gun to protect my family. So what we see there is someone who's utilizing the resources that they have in this context of historical abandonment. So I think that's really key, and that's a story that's reoccurring every day in courtrooms. I can't tell you the amount of gun possession cases I've had when the first thing that I get told is, hey, Emmanuel, I had to have it on me. I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. It's a constant reoccurring story, but then we all play, and I don't want to, for all the great police people out there, I'm not pointing to the police. I'm actually pointing inwards to us as institutions and what we have okayed and how even us as attorneys, we ignore that and we go forward with the case. So in terms of stories, those are what they usually look like consistently. But in terms of what we've done, and we see it through social media, I mean, there's tons of stuff out there on surveillance, firsthand, like they're following the conflict. You can follow some of it now because it's popularized. If you have a cell phone after this, look up Young and Ace and Fulio. Just Google those two names. Google the songs that come out, the conflict that come out of that. But what we've chosen to do in terms of investing in criminalized healing.
For a story that I was working on last week, I was at St. Sabina talking to, the brave youth leaders there, and the person who's in charge of that, Lamar Johnson, and he was essentially telling me that these people that are in his organization, they express that exact sentiment that you mentioned, this idea of judged by 12 rather than carried by 6. Father Kelly, I want to bring you in here and essentially ask you about the conflict that a lot of these, especially youth, are dealing with here. Confession was mentioned earlier in a different context, but I guess my question for you is, have you heard the toil in people's minds in regards to what they should do and how they should handle seemingly impossible situations?
So much of my life I've been working as a priest in detention centers, mostly here in Chicago, Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, Cook County Jail. I also have lived on the south side of Chicago for 40 years, communities that have been impacted by violence and incarceration. And the stories has changed over the course of those 40 years. 40 years ago, when a kid came into juvenile detention center and with a gun case, oftentimes you would think, well, what were you going to do with that gun now? You know you're up to something. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, you got caught, and that was kind of the storyline that often happened that long ago. But today, it's a completely different storyline. And I'm a pretty stubborn individual, so it took me a while to catch on. Story after story after story, you start to believe maybe there's something truth here. And it really is about feeling unsafe. I was talking to a young person on Tuesday night in juvenile detention center, and he's in on a gun case, and he had been shot 8 times. And so his story to me, which I believe, is that the same sentiment we're saying here, I have to carry a gun. I firmly believe that most of the kids that I deal with, both in the neighborhood and in juvenile, they all know someone who has been killed, been harmed. They learn that early on, at the age of 9 years old. They know, too, that it's dangerous to walk from our center, which is in the back of the yards neighborhood, less than a block to the park. That's a dangerous trek. And they know, too, and this is probably the most troublesome to me, they know, too, that adults can't protect them or won't protect them. And I'm not talking about just police. I'm talking about community organizations, I'm talking about neighbors, I'm talking about family, I'm talking about all of us. It's an indictment on all of us. And so you have this 15-year-old who knows intimately violence, knows it's dangerous to walk around, and you have this plethora of guns, the availability of guns. And so this young person protects him or herself with a gun. Years ago, it was more structured in regards to gangs, gang warfare, you had turfs. Today, it's about trauma and interpersonal conflicts where someone disrespects me. And in that disrespect, especially if it's on public media where everybody knows about it, then that triggers things in me. And I become something that I wouldn't have otherwise become. So really, I truly believe that the gun dialogue shouldn't be in the criminal justice arena, but it should be in the public health arena. We ought to deal with what are some of the underlying causes for young people or anybody carrying a gun and deal with those, and I think that we would get a lot further along in this conversation if we didn't just see this as a criminal justice legal kind of argument.
You know, when it comes to changing people's minds, especially those who don't have the experience, so often they're asking for data. They're asking for something to change their mind, to prove to them that the anecdotes that you may be hearing from those who experience this is real. And so I want to bring in Professor Vargas here. I believe you've done some research in regards to the relationship between people who carry and those who are involved in gun violence. And I'm wondering if you can go through that a bit.
Yes, sure. Thank you. It's great to be part of this panel. So I have reviewed dozens of studies in journals across the social sciences related to violence, reviewed grants for the National Science Foundation. And the role of criminal penalties as a predictor of violence is it's not taken seriously enough that you can publish a study without controlling for the level of criminal penalties in a neighborhood or city or jurisdiction and get it published, in part because no one takes it seriously as a predictive factor of violence at any geographic unit of analysis. All of that said, right, the average citizen probably isn't reading peer-reviewed articles and isn't informed by this research. And so if you just look at the narratives put forth by the police department, they don't even claim that it reduces violence. Our police superintendent will tell you, when framing the logic of criminalization and criminal penalties, he'll frame it as something that the victims need. This is something, what about the victims or justice for the victims as the basis of criminalization of guns. And so what that tells you is that from a social scientific perspective, it's not just an issue of what intervention or what penalties are effective. It's a problem of these criminal penalties being a form of political currency in the absence of effective policies, organizations like the police, like the mayor's office, have to make something out of these traumatic experiences, have to produce metrics, have to produce something that could fit into the narrative for a re-election campaign. And this is essential because even if you're the most liberal candidate, whoever you're running against is going to raise the issue, is likely going to raise the issue that you are too soft on crime, that crime is up because you haven't advocated for these particular penalties. And that leaves us in a situation where we, in some ways, are also talking about, we're talking a lot about violence, but we're really talking about the role of violence in our politics, in the ways that the practice of searching for violence or incarceration as a solution to all of our problems, like identifying that as a driving force between a lot of the bad policy that we have is one of the key issues that we have to deal with in tackling this conversation about gun possession and the law.
You know, I think there is one thing that affects everyone up here, for better or for worse, and that's media. As the media representative up here, I say sorry to start with. I'm always curious to hear from people on the advocate side, the folks who are often affected by our words and our reports about what effect it's having and how good or bad of a job we are doing. And I think in Chicago in particular, third largest media market in the country, the media is just this cloud that kind of hangs over everything you do. And so I guess my question here is, and I think this is for anyone, I'll start with Kofi. What role is the media playing in this narrative? How can we as a group do better? And are we, making any inroads at all? Have you seen things get better over time?
That's the trick bag, right? That, America's supposed to have, a free press, unbiased, objective, just getting information out, and that's pretty much it. But we know that's not the truth, right? It's primarily another kind of tool for state propaganda. And the way that kind of unfolds with talking about intercommunal violence is that 10 times out of 10, you get the perspective of the police. Like any media release, any reporting always comes from the narrative of the police, right? Or you get numbers, this many shootings happen. You may get one or two people where you actually learn their name, but you don't know anything else about them, right? It was a tragedy that this person was killed, right? And then there's a lot of speculation. So the media, unfortunately, just kind of reinforces the norms and the culture and legitimacy of the prison industrial complex, of policing, et cetera. And you may have one or two reporters or one or two kind of publications that may challenge some of those norms, but predominantly the media just, again, legitimizes this narrative and criminalizes young Black and brown people and legitimizes the state. So it's this twofold kind of thing. So I know we were talking about social media in the context of young people kind of using it for their interpersonal beefs or whatever. But the other powerful thing, at least about the young people, is they use social media, even though social media in itself is problematic too, but they use social media to put their narratives out, right? To challenge the narrative, to look at root causes of violence, to personalize and humanize survivors of violence, and to put out this call of police and prison abolition, to put out this call of healing and restorative justice, to put out this call of getting resources to their communities. anytime that I've personally interviewed with the media or my young people have interviewed with the media, you know, we have to be very careful of being short and succinct because you'll want them to quote you about your perspective on abolition, for example, but they won't speak on that because it doesn't fit the narrative that they're trying to put out. They're very particular, you know, and I'm assuming these are the producers and the heads and what have you. They're very particular in telling a story that fits, again, what has been normalized and not telling a particular truth or not highlighting a particular thing. So I'm very critical of the media and the way it perpetuates violence and the way it perpetuates state propaganda. And if there wasn't for independent outlets, if it wasn't for local media like The Tribe, the Chicago Reporter, and so many other publications and social media, we wouldn't get these other stories, these other narratives. That's a problem for me.
This is informative for me, so I'm gonna stick here just for a little bit, if you guys don't mind. Emmanuel, what would you want to see when you cut on your local newscast? You know what I mean? Because so often you are working with the folks that are being covered indirectly. They may not necessarily be speaking to the people that you are representing, but they are speaking about people that you are representing. And so I'm wondering, what are the things when you cut on the news you want to see that you don't?
You know, I think some of the things that I would want to see a lot more of is, you know, more of the holistic story. It's the narrative becomes very clear cut. It's very binary. You're either a perpetrator or you're a victim. And to be able to walk through someone, let's say, who gets arrested for a gun possession, to be able to walk through the impact that has had, first of all, learning about how they got to where they got to, but the impact that process has on them as individuals, their family, and the community as a whole, I think is absolutely critical. And I think those are more the stories to be able to see. And it's counter where we're at now because this is the era of the sound bites, right? So if you're looking for a sound bite, you know, go to Nas, I Gave You Power, which is a well-known song. I know you brought Harlem up earlier, so I can't, you know, I'm originally from Harlem. I'm black, but I'm not as muscular as I would love. But in that song, it's a song about a gun. And it's a song about how power and identity is formed. And I think that's mainly what the media does, is it controls the identity. And so more of that, I would say, and then also more of just being able to reporting directly from communities and seeing stories through. Those are quickly for me.
Absolutely. You know, I want to transition a little bit and get back to Professor Vargas for a second. You know, I saw online you sort of taking up the mantle to stop CPD's use of ShotSpotter, and I'm sure there are other folks up here who disagree with its use, and seemingly decrease the city's reliance on police to stop violence more broadly. And so I guess my question there is, you know, give me the problem with this technology as you see it, and what data there is that this kind of tool is leading to more violence in these communities, not less.
Yeah, where to start?
Take your time.
First is, one is just the absence of independent evaluation. So the data that ShotSpotter produced are owned by ShotSpotter, the private company. And so typically when an evaluation is done, let's say with the city, a government program, researchers will sign a proprietary data agreement with the city, stipulating the sharing of data and that sort of thing. Companies like ShotSpotter don't do this because they equate the sharing of this data as sharing intellectual property. And so they cite competition, concerns about competition and sharing intellectual property as the basis for rejecting independent evaluation. And so right off the bat, there's no independent evaluation of ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter will point to you, will point to the consulting firm that they hired to evaluate their program, but anyone with the common sense would question that evaluation. So that's point one. Point two is just the sheer fact that ShotSpotter, if you just, let's say if you just take it at face value, you give the technology the benefit of the doubt. What it does is detect gunshots and alerts police to respond to the scene of a crime. That's it. It doesn't provide any more context or information of what the police officers are responding to. And so when you think about all of the possible things that can go wrong, when a police officer is given no information, but just told that a shot was fired, and literally anyone who's in the vicinity could be a potential suspect, could have been the person who fired it. And so in some ways, it's not only just a disservice to the communities that are that are where these ShotSpotter devices are set up, it's a disservice to the police officers because they're set up in a situation to fail, essentially, a situation to make a serious mistake. And so I couldn't think of a technology that creates a more dangerous context for something to go wrong than ShotSpotter. And I can keep going on and on, but I feel like those two points really capture the issue pretty well.
Yeah, you know, Father Kelly, I want you to jump in here if you don't mind, because it occurs to me that when police come in guns blazing, you know, you have to deal with the fallout there. Or at the very least, this is impacting the community with the members that you work with. And so I guess my question is, that police presence that so often is sent in to deal with this issue, does it do what it's intended to do?
It might do what it's intended to do, but I think the intention can be wrong. It's intended to find somebody who is guilty and use the punitive system that we have and punish that person. But it doesn't get at what are some of the underlying issues and some of the underlying causes of some of the conflicts that are happening in our community. And that can never be happening by the police. We can't police our way out of this. Young people don't think about, man, am I going to get caught if I have this gun? What they're thinking about is how safe am I to go from here to there? Or what do I need to do to protect myself? And so I think that even the discussion, the police can add, you know, if they're community-based policing and they really have a relationship with the community, then they can have a good impact. Oftentimes we strive to create that relationship through, you know, the police come, they play softball, play basketball with the young people. There's that kind of healthy kind of bantering going back and forth. But when they come in, you know, fully dressed, fully armed, and stand there, you know, and try to intimidate our young people, that doesn't do any good. That doesn't help the situation at all. So really it is about trying to, and here's the other thing that I truly believe, and one of the big problems we have is the criminal justice system, the courts, the police have absolutely no respect for the community. They see the community as the problem. And I firmly believe, having done this for all this time, that the only real solution is in the community. And you have to empower and give resources to the community to be able to do what they already know they need to do. They just don't have the resources toward that. So the inequities that are part of all this conversation, are very much a part of the gun dialogue and the violence dialogue. That our communities on the South and West Side in particular have been under-resourced for so many generations that it has started to decay the fabric of that community. And what I truly believe, one of the things we're trying to do is, and Emmanuel's involved in this as well, we're really trying to create a community that is in deep relationship with one another. David Brooks calls it a thick community. You know, a community where neighbors begin to trust one another and rely on one another and ask for help from one another, and then will support one another when these issues happen. Right now, the only response is 911. That's the only, if I want a quick response, semi-quick in the South Side, call 911. But we have to have a different mechanism, a different way to resolve the issues and the problems within our own community, and that has to come from the community itself.
You know, I'm really glad you brought up the idea of resources in these communities. Kofi, you lifelong Chicagoan, right? Talk to me about growing up here, because I'm from Texas. I'm from Houston originally. But talk to me about growing up in a city and knowing a particular block has been that way, has had a certain lack of resources, a lack of commitment, despite alderman after alderman and mayor after mayor saying that we care about these folks, we care about these communities, we are going to change this community, but not seeing it happen. And then, I guess, adding on top of that, the fact that ultimately the blame falls on that community. And so often they are the ones who bear the brunt of the blame despite these promises that continue to come down. And so I want you to talk about growing up here and some of that abandonment of resources that Father Kelly alluded to.
Well, if I can peel that onion back a little bit more and just kind of touch on what was said earlier, this country we live in, we have to understand we are in a settler colonial situation, right? This country was built off of land theft and genocide. This country was built off bondage, forced labor, and genocide, and complete destruction of culture, identity, religion, etc. And from that, through the annals of history, again, genocide, slavery, Reconstruction, civil rights movement, to where we are at now. What comes out of that white supremacy, what comes out of racialized capitalism, what comes out of that is, again, the infrastructure and the building of the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex. America, as we know, is a huge arms dealer globally, right? When it proliferates its imperialism and does resource extraction from other countries, it produces and sells arms, right? Defense contractors, corporations, et cetera, right? So we have to deal with that contradiction of the violence that comes out of America. Everybody's in conversation about, Afghanistan and Iraq and the Middle East, and also, what's happening on the continent in Africa, as well as Southern America, right? We have a conversation, we don't have this bigger conversation of the violence that American culture, American as the United States as a society perpetuates all of this violence. It exports it, and then it cages and houses people that don't commit state-sanctioned violence, right? It's interpersonal violence. There's consequences for that. So I just wanted to name that bigger conversation, that bigger contradiction, because when we hyper-focus on individuals in Black and brown communities, it's very easy to, again, criminalize them or other them and make folks that are attracted to gun culture, because gun culture is an American culture, right? So I just wanted to name that. But as somebody who grew up on 78th and Fielden, lived in the Hunnits, currently in Woodlawn, who's battling against the Obama Center, right? Because I'm witnessing real life gentrification happening in my community. But I look back to the 60s at a very specific example in time where you saw the Vice Lords, the Blackstones, and the Disciples being resourced and kind of transforming what was happening in their community. At the same time, you had the Black Panther Party for self-defense with Fred Hampton, Chairman Fred, and others also organizing in the community. Something very specific happened between like 67 and 1971. Initially, you saw money going into Lawndale and the vice lords connecting with people that got them resources so they can open up an ice cream parlor, so they can open up a clothing store, so they can open up several other different kind of businesses. At the same time, in Woodlawn, you saw the Blackstones and the Disciples also kind of getting those resources. And what you saw is a huge reduction in violence that was happening. You saw a transformation of identity and thinking, right? And the same thing with the Black Panther Party. They were doing free breakfast. They were doing free healthcare. It was a clinic that folks could go to. What you saw was State's Attorney Hanrahan, I always mispronounce his name, but him working in conjunction with the FBI, just the whole apparatus. They created the gang unit. They criminalized them. Mayor Daley Sr. criminalized all of them in the media, and those resources started to disappear. So not only did they undermine the work that Bobby Gore, Jeff Ford at the time, and others were doing, they took resources away from them. They ended up locking up and targeting leadership. As we know, they assassinated Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in the West Side after the uprisings that happened in the 60s after the assassination of King. There's parts of the West Side that still haven't been fixed, right, that have been burnt down since the 60s. So I say all that to say that we had a transformational turning point in the late 60s and early 70s where folks that were being labeled gangs and criminalized, as they were trying to transform themselves and their communities, they were purposefully sabotaged. And to my time coming up in the late 90s, early 2000s, and to the young people doing their thing now, they're dealing with the same cycle of poverty, of intergenerational trauma, of incarceration. So it seems to me as though the state benefits for perpetuating and keeping these systems in place and keeping people in perpetual harm and perpetual poverty and perpetual trauma, because that's a part of being colonized. So for my thing, true radical liberation and to break free from the bondage of this reality that we have been subjected to since our ancestors were in chains, that's the real conversation. So these reforms and these little things here and there, they're good for harm reduction. They're good for, alleviating some of the pain. But until we take a hard look at, what this society produces and its values and the systems that lead it, white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, all of these kind of things, we're just fooling ourselves. I know that was the long end of the answer, and I went all over the place, but I just felt the need to express that.
Yeah. No, I think it's important to cover it all. I'm glad we got to solutions, because I think every one of these conversations doesn't pass the muster if you don't actually get to solutions. I did an interview with Kim Fox less than a month ago, and one of the things that she mentioned was she recognizes this difference between what she called nonviolent gun offenders versus violent gun offenders, and the idea that they should be treated differently. The folks that are carrying in order to defend themselves and have no intention on harming someone else should be treated differently in the legal system than those who actually commit some type of harm. And so, Emmanuel, I want to ask you, one, are you seeing that play out legally, when you go to court and represent these folks? And two, what role does the legal system, we got a room full of lawyers here, what role does the legal system play in reducing this harm that Kofi was talking about?
So the quick answer, do I see it play out? How do I see it? Is it playing out in court? No, it's not. To be honest with you, in many instances, especially throughout Chicago, it is exactly that. There is no real differentiating between somebody who happened to carry versus somebody who used the firearm. There's no differentiation. The concept of victimhood does not exist. I'm gonna just give you this quick example. Even right now, I know everyone's heard of that quote, hurt people, Carl Bell, right? So even right now, I've worked with young people who end up getting incarcerated because they've carried a gun and then they're incarcerated in the same place as the person who they know have shot them. Literally who they know have shot them. So a lot of this speaks back to what are we investing in and how we're keeping things as they are. And this perverse incentive, I mean, I know you asked Father Dave that question about, is the intention being met? It absolutely is being met, because at the end of the day, we have the regulation of black and brown bodies. That's what all of this is. So even afterwards, after someone goes through that traumatic experience, they still have the gun offender registry. There's no delineation between who's a possessor or who's not. But these are many things, though, that as I look out here, that I'm excited about, because there's plenty of brilliant minds who hopefully won't stay silent and follow in the way things are.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I want to stay on this track in regards to solution-oriented conversation. Father Kelly, you mentioned earlier this, I guess, police playing basketball in the community, so to speak, and kind of the idea of community policing that's being put out there. And I guess my question for you is, one, do you believe that sort of community policing helps? And if not, what does that look like? Or, you know, do you kind of take to Kofi's point that we need to do away with it entirely?
I don't think the solution is with the police. I think you can have policing that is more community-based, has a deeper relationship with the community, and that's helpful. But I don't think that's not the solution. I think the solution has to lie in the community and building relationships, and really, you know, we're a restorative justice organization where I'm from, and really dealing with what is the harm and how do we repair the harm versus what did you do and what are we going to do to you to punish you? Because that just gets us into further violence, systemic violence. I firmly believe we're less safe because of many aspects of the criminal justice system. But I really believe that if you're going to get at some of the things that you need to get at, it's got to be built around relationships and listening to our young people. One of the things, we're talking about gun violence and young people, and young people know some of the solutions. They know what's going on, and yet we don't listen to them as adults. And so I think, for me at least, part of it is to really focus on building relationships and repairing the harms that are part of these communities. And policing oftentimes interferes with that, because they change the narrative that you're a bad person versus the narrative that you're a young person who's been through a lot of trauma and you're just trying to find your way in this world. But nobody really focuses on that. They focus on, you know, even in the media, we were talking about the media before, at the end of that, whatever happened, and he was a known gang member, as though you deserved it because you were a known gang member. And I think that really is problematic, that we're really not getting at some of the underlying causes that's fueling some of this hurt and pain in our communities.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, because so often empathy feels like it's missing from this conversation. And from, you know, talking to the folks who brought me in to do this panel, that was a large part of the reasoning. We need to insert empathy back into this conversation. And so I put this out to anybody on the panel. How does that take place? Is it the media? Is it through the legal system? You know, this is something that is decades, centuries in the making, kind of the situation that we're in. And so I'm wondering how you take someone who doesn't work in these communities, or maybe has never been south of Roosevelt, you know, how you make those folks feel that empathy for people they may not necessarily relate to or have any reason to interact with. I'll pass it to Emmanuel since you're looking this way.
You know, I'm always worried about the lawyer talking too much. But so I think there has to be that investment, right? So there's the investment in resources, and right now we know where a lot of the investment is going to, you know, spot shot and all these new technologies. But you can also have, if you look around, just the amount of communities of faith that exists around Chicago, and what would it look like for us to say as a community, we're gonna go into these courtrooms and we're gonna work directly with one individual. We're gonna continue to do that and build that relationships to start to see people as they are. So I think that's critical. And another specific solution, there's organizations out there, you know, Good Kids Mad City is a new organization called Stick Talk, Look them up. Phenomenal. This is an organization that is predominantly young people talking about guns, about their survivors, talking about guns and gun possession and what they need to know. And we need to be able to create the space to be able to build those relationships.
Yeah, yeah. You know, Kofi, I want to bring you in really quickly because it occurs to me that so often the only representation that someone watching the news who doesn't work in these spaces may have of reform is an organization like Good Kids Mad City, is your Twitter account even, right? So I'm wondering, do you believe that, are you trying to build empathy across the line, or is it less about that? Is it more about revolution? Is it more about getting what you want and kind of how you feel about it be damned?
So a couple of things. One, when you're trying to get your message out, when you're trying to organize people, our position is always trying to meet people where they're at, right? And when I say that, I'm talking about people within our community. The folks who we know already have their biases, their prejudice, their worldview. I'm not necessarily looking for empathy from them, right? I'm trying to build power to move them, right, one way or the other. But to your earlier point around solutions and the young people, you know, Good Kids Mad City, they're a group of young people that are survivors of gun violence, have been directly impacted by it, have lost loved ones to gun violence, and yet they're coming from this empathetic view that now they're trying to put policy out called the Peace Book, would essentially would incentivize peace building in communities. It's not necessarily the violence interrupter model, because it's taking it a step further of not just identifying people in the community that have that credibility to become peacekeepers, but also to build a culture of peace. Right now they have what's called the Peace Pledge Challenge, where they are in high schools having young people take a vow to nonviolence, to building, you know, to using restorative justice practices, and then educating them on that, right? So we are also a part of the Defund CPD campaign. We're trying to get 2% of, you know, CPD's budget, which is now about to be $1.9 billion, ridiculous. But just 2% of that only comes out to about $35.6 million. It would go directly towards communities, directly towards young people, being the arbitrators of peace in their neighborhood. And then challenging, you know, the culture, what I call the deaf culture, of young people that was, you know, kind of speaked about earlier, right? This sort of glorification of violence, this kind of hyper visualization of interpersonal beef with people. So to be able to intervene in that through social media, being able to curate culture and music that puts out different messaging, that is part of the goal of what the young people have been organizing around. So if you get a chance, just Google the Peace Book Ordinance. They have a petition. They're trying to get it through City Council right now. And to the professor's point earlier when he was talking about ShotSpotter, you know, Lori Lightfoot and others are scrambling to sue people, right, to again criminalize people to deal with violence. It's not going to be effective. There's already data that shows that approach is not effective whatsoever. So we're saying on the other end, let's invest in healing, let's invest in restorative justice, let's invest in conflict resolution, violence interruption, all of the above, and let's give young people the tools to do it. I myself, as an adult, can't come in and be as effective as my young people when they have these peer-to-peer relationship building to build peace and to build love. Then lastly, it has to be holistic. Like my brother was saying earlier, you know, we're trying to be in CPS, we're trying to be in the juvenile detention centers. We want young people to see this work happening, whether they're standing on the block, whether they're in the classroom, or whether they're unfortunately incarcerated. They need to be touched on every aspect of their life for this to be normalized. And then they need access to mental health care, right? Trauma and mental health is a huge issue. We don't have enough resources towards that. It's connected to housing justice issues. There's not enough housing stability, food insecurity. All of these things have to be holistically dealt with before we can even think about really getting to gun violence. So that's what the young people are fighting for. I'm supporting them part of that. You know, it's an intergenerational struggle. They're going through what I went through, and I went through with my elders, what they went through, right? So we're trying to break these cycles. So that's the work I see.
Yeah, Professor Vargas, I'm hoping you can weigh in here. I'm wondering, based on the fact that you work in this area, what solutions you see? Because obviously there are corporations, there are entities and systems in place that kind of keep a tool like ShotSpotter moving the way it is. And so I'm wondering, how exactly do you tackle something where, you know, money is involved, obviously, where there is money and time and effort put into keeping a tool like that in place? How, from your perspective, do you combat that, and what does the solution look like?
So I'm going to try to answer this in a way that touches upon so many of the amazing points that have been made by my co-panelists. Sitting here listening, my mind is just exploding out of all the things that they're talking about. I think the overarching point that's going to like bring everything that I'm going to say together is recognizing and trying to move beyond the neoliberal frame of thinking that's undergirding our conceptions of the problem and our thinking of solutions. Because what I mean by neoliberal is the focus on the individual perpetrator, the individual victim, the individual rights, the individual act of crime, et cetera, down the line. Because and moving away from the individual and thinking about communities and thinking about this in terms of institutions. And when you think about it at the community and institutional level, then that's an entirely different set of processes and actions that enter the picture. And to this point, Kofi had mentioned the point about settler colonialism. And I'm going to use that as an example of a community level kind of intervention involving the law that can be used to and applied in these circumstances. So bear with me while I give you like this really short story of a research finding and of a project that we're working on. So my lab has been digitizing homicide data in Chicago dating back to 1870, individual cases of homicide, to look at centuries worth of trends at the community level. Long story short, there are a dozen or so neighborhoods in the city of Chicago that have historically always had extremely low homicide rates, flat towards the bottom from the very beginning. This is where settler colonialism comes in, because these neighborhoods, Hyde Park, Lakeview, Rogers Park, Norwood Park, Edison Park, they were all founded as settlements. You gotta remember, in the 1800s when Chicago was founded, it was founded when indigenous land was cleared, capital came in, folks trying to cash in, established their own townships. Like Rogers Park is literally named after a guy named Rogers. And over time, when Chicago grew and was annexing all of these settlements around it, a really mind-blowing finding that my team discovered recently, that in 1870, the state of Illinois passed the Illinois Annexation Act. And what it did was it provided rights to settlements being annexed to a city. It provided them political rights. So when Rogers Park was being annexed into the city of Chicago, they were given the right to representation in the city council, which meant that a ward had to be drawn to represent that entire community to make sure that it was being looked after. We've digitized the ward maps of the city of Chicago dating back to its founding. These very same dozen communities that have had historically low homicide rates have never changed wards. Never. And it's a fact. It is a protection that is provided by the law. And so when we think about solutions and imaginations, this is why the power of institutional thinking comes in. Look to the communities that are affluent, that are protected. Look at the way that law is engineered and structured to protect them, to give them rights. Some of the most clear examples of things to work on with respect as it relates to the issues of violence and gun possession is rethinking the big box ordinance, right? Business, small businesses, street vending is a an economic lifeline in many, many low-income neighborhoods, and we criminalize this in the city of Chicago. Go to Vietnam, go to any quote-unquote developing country, and you'll see that many folks earn their living off of their small businesses, and we in the city of Chicago don't have that. We criminalize that. So how can we engineer and use the law to think of ways to provide rights to these communities, to provide stable and consistent political representation, such that community organizers working on the street to rethink public safety don't have to combat the 5 or 6 different city council members who represent their neighborhood because they've been gerrymandered since the 1960s. And one last point relates to Father Kelly's point about, working with police, and I am of the perspective that police should be a part of these solutions. And this is to the point about empathy, because I think one of the ways that the status quo with respect to policy is justified is rhetoric about how you need a balanced approach. This is coming straight from the mayor's office in terms of the budget, that you need both policing and you need social services. And so this is framed as a combination. When you look at the reality of it, though, it's an incredibly unbalanced combination. Framing it as a combination is a total misrepresentation when one entity, the stick, is getting billions of dollars, and the carrots are getting millions, if that. And so this is part of the conversations about coalition building and empathy, is bringing reality and contesting the claims in the ways that balance is being put forth, because, and this is the last point, is that some of the best work on the social scientific history of criminal justice shows that they're based in liberal thinking, leftist thinking. Think about the 90s and the crime bill, the 60s and the war on poverty. What we're seeing now is the same reproduction of a war on guns that's being justified under the guise of fair and balanced social policy, when in reality, it is not.
Okay. It is 1:15 on the dot, guys. I hope that everyone gained something from this conversation, but by all means, please give it up for my panelists and for the conversation they have provided. I was told that you all must, with underlined and bolded letter, walk out of here at 1:15, so I'm going to end it there. My name is Jamal Andress. Thank you all for being here. Coming up at 1:25, in just 10 minutes, we have From Bad to Worse, Chicago's Response to Gun Possession. That is the next panel that we have. Again, thank you all so much for joining me, and we'll see you soon.